All right, deep diver, buckle up. We're going to get into plant drought tolerance today. Especially with the changing climate, this is super relevant. And you sent over some interesting research. I'm really curious about this. And from what I've been reading, there are like these two major strategies that plants use to survive droughts. Yeah. Isohydric and Anisohydric.
Right, exactly. And they're like total opposites when it comes to water management.
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah, you can think of water potential as like water pressure in a pipe.
Okay.
So higher pressure means the water's going to flow more easily.
Gotcha.
And so isohydric plants are all about keeping that consistent high water pressure inside their leaves.
Even when water's scarce.
Even when it's really scarce.
Wow.
They're like the ultimate budgeters. They're carefully rationing their water supply.
That makes them less likely to run out, I guess?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they do this by really tightly regulating the water loss through their stomata.
So this all helps them avoid dehydration.
It does, but the thing is, it can also limit their growth, especially when there's plenty of water around.
Makes sense. They're playing it safe.
Yeah.
So what about the anisohydric plants? Are they more like risk takers?
Yeah, you could definitely say that they're more willing to let their internal water pressure kind of go up and down, and they keep their stomata open wider so they can take in more carbon dioxide.
And that lets them grow faster.
Exactly.
Even when water is limited.
Even when it's limited.
But wouldn't that be a problem in places where like the climate's really unpredictable?
That's the trade-off. It's advantageous where you have these kind of periodic droughts, but they are much more vulnerable to severe or prolonged water stress.
This reminds me of one of the research papers that you shared on poplar trees.
Yeah.
It compared two different species that had totally different drought tolerance strategies. Mm-hmm. And it talked about their potential for being used in biofuel production.
Oh, yeah, the poplar study. It's a great example of how this plays out in the real world. The isohydric poplar, the Populus balsamifera, grew slower when there was enough water around, which is what we would expect.
Right.
But when things got dry, it totally outperformed that Anisohydric Populus simonii.
So that means choosing the right poplar species for a certain climate could have a huge impact on biofuel production.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's where this plant array system really comes in.
Okay, how so?
We can screen a ton of plants and pick out the ones that are best suited for specific environments and the challenges that they might face.
So we're like learning to speak the plant's language in a way. So how do these strategies actually work at the cellular level?
Well, isohydric plants, because they're all about keeping that high water potential, they usually have smaller, thicker leaves with more stomata.
Yeah, and these adaptations help them hold on to water more effectively. Anisohydric plants, on the other hand, they tend to have larger, thinner leaves.
So they can maximize their surface area for photosynthesis.
Exactly. But that makes them lose water more easily, too.
So like we were saying before, it's like they're built for speed, but not necessarily for endurance.
Right, exactly. And these differences, they go deeper than just the leaf structure. Their cellular mechanisms for water transport, those are different, too. You remember osmotic water permeability?
Yeah, that's like how easily water can move within the plant, right?
Yeah. It's like how some pipes let water flow through easier than others. Okay, that's a good way to think about it.
So isohydric plants, they tend to have lower osmotic water permeability.
So that's another part of their water-saving strategy.
Exactly. They're basically slowing down that flow of water inside their cells.
To conserve it. Makes sense. What about anisohydric plants then?
Well, they often have higher osmotic water permeability.
So the water can move more quickly for growth.
Exactly. And this brings us to those aquaporins we were talking about before.
Oh, right. Those tiny water channels.
Yeah, they're super important for regulating water transport within the plant cells.
So does that mean isohydric plants have fewer aquaporins? Or maybe they're just less efficient?
That's a good question. It's complicated and scientists are still figuring it all out.
Oh, okay.
But we do know that messing with aquaporin expression can actually change how a plant responds to drought.
Yeah. Like that research with the tomato plants.
Right.
They overexpressed a specific aquaporin gene, the SLTIP2, and that actually made them more anisohydric.
It did. Those tomato plants were able to keep their transpiration rates higher even when they were stressed.
Did they grow faster too?
They did. They were more drought tolerant and they produced more fruit.
So by changing those aquaporins, they basically hacked the plant's water regulation system. But are there any downsides?
Well, we always have to think about the ethics, and what could happen to the environment.
That's a good point. Okay, but getting back to the plant array system, how can it help us understand this connection between aquaporins and drought tolerance?
Well, the system is great for phenotyping. Remember, that's all about looking at a plant's observable traits and its genetic potential.
Right. It's like figuring out if a plant's a marathon runner or a sprinter when it comes to water.
Exactly.
So we get all this information about how the plant's dealing with water stress.
In real time. And this is huge for researchers and breeders.
Yeah, because they can identify drought-tolerant traits and develop new crop varieties.
Exactly. And even figure out how to use water more efficiently.
So it's not just about drought tolerance then.
No, not at all. We can use it to study all sorts of plant traits, like disease resistance and how well they use nutrients.
It's like the possibilities are endless.
They really are, and that's why phenotyping is becoming so important these days. It's helping us move past those traditional breeding methods.
And it lets us develop crops that are tougher, more productive, and better for the environment.
You know, this deep dive is really making me think about how complex plants are.
Me too. I never realized how much goes into just surviving a drought.
It's amazing, right? And we're still just scratching the surface of understanding it all.
Speaking of scratching the surface, there's one thing I'm still wondering about. So we've talked about these isohydric and anisohydric plants like they're in these totally separate boxes. But is it possible for a plant to be like a little bit of both?
That's a really great question, and it's something that a lot of researchers are trying to figure out right now.
Okay.
There's more and more evidence that suggests that some plants can actually change how they regulate their water.
Depending on the environment.
Exactly.
Right.
It's like they're always checking out what's going on around them, and then they adjust to survive.
So they could be more isohydric when water's scarce,
Yeah.
and then switch to anisohydric when there's more water available.
Right. That kind of flexibility could be a huge advantage when the climate's unpredictable.
Yeah, for sure. But how do they even do that? Is there something that triggers that change?
That's what we need to figure out. But scientists think things like soil, moisture, air temperature, and even the amount of light could all play a role.
It's like they're getting all these signals from the environment and deciding what to do.
Yeah, it's way more complex than just saying a plant is one or the other, you know?
Right, it's more like a spectrum.
Yeah, and some plants are probably a lot more adaptable than others.
I see. And that's where this plant array system could really help us out, right?
Absolutely. By watching how a plant responds over time, we can get a much better understanding of how they're doing it.
It's like having this behind-the-scenes look at how plants adapt.
Exactly. And that knowledge is going to be so important for developing crops that can handle climate change.
Definitely.
This deep dive has been amazing. I've learned so much about how plants handle drought.
Me too. It's incredible to see all the different ways they've adapted to survive.
And there's still so much more to discover.
There's always something new to learn.
Until next time.
Happy deep diving.